This is Understanding Existentialism. My name is Mark Thorsby, and today we're going to be discussing The Postmodern Condition by Jean-François Lyotard, who's an important postmodern or post-structuralist philosopher from the latter part of the 20th century. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you guys are doing well. If you've been following the series, you know that the first that in our last video, we took a look at Derrida's notion of difference and also its relationship to what's known as deconstruction. And we saw there that Derrida argued that there's a play in language, and that ultimately that play can result in both can result in the stability or instability of meaning. And this allows us to reconfigure our concepts and so forth. And it was something of an ontological conception, or similar to the ontological difference in Heidegger. So that was Derrida. And we were sort of looking at the way in which language has a sort of metaphysical instability. And here, what we're going to look at today is the way in which language relates to the social. And we'll talk about how instead of using the concept of difference or deconstruction from Derrida, we'll be looking at Ludwig Wittgenstein's conception of language games. So let's jump right into it. I hope you guys are doing well, and I'm glad you're joining me. So first off, just a couple little things about Lyotard. He was born in 1924 and died in 1998. He was a prominent French philosopher. He was born in Versailles. He attended the Sorbonne. Interestingly enough, his master's thesis in graduate school is on the notion of indifference as an ethical concept, and he actually participated in the struggle against the Nazis to free Paris and France from occupation in 1944. He had a long teaching career. He taught at both at La Fèche as well as the Sorbonne. And additionally many universities here in the United States, including UC Irvine, Emory University, Yale, and as well as in Montreal, Canada. So he taught all over the world. In 1954, he joined a radical socialist movement and helped found it called Socialism or Barbarism. And he actually was a very staunch, I would say, political activist. So that's something to remember as we're reading him today. We'll be talking about the way in which society is changing, and you can get a sense here of what his concerns are potentially as an activist. And we'll see some familiar language that activists frequently used, particularly with relation to whether or not corporations rule the world and so forth. He also helped organize the student protest in Paris of May 1968. So that gives a little bit historical credence to his activism, as it were. Tragically, in 1998, he died of leukemia. And so we lost him as a philosopher. So anyway, that's a little bit about Lyotard. Let's jump into some of the key concepts just as an overview. So in the background, I want you to be thinking about the notion of post-structuralism. He's a post-structuralist. Now, what is structuralism? Structuralism is, let's say, a philosophical movement and or position that looks to identify the structure of meaning. So just to give a sort of example, some structuralist theorists, for instance, when they look at film or film criticism, will break down the structure of the film into its archetypes and so forth. And so this was a lot of philosophers were structuralist in the mid to early 20th century. But he's a post-structuralist, meaning that he's more interested in articulating the notion that these structures are not as stable as one might think. We're going to see that today. He's also known as one of the leading quote-unquote postmodern theorists. We should mention, though, that postmodernism really refers to a lot of different things, but we'll see exactly today how Lyotard defines it for himself. Another critical thing we're going to see today is that Lyotard uses the concept of language games, which comes from the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. And then we'll talk about that today, but ultimately what we're going to see, though, is to understand what a language is, don't think of it as having a fundamental logical structure that, like a code or something, we might write a computer code for a video game. It's not that there is a logical structure, but that structure is not essential to language. Instead, that structure is dependent upon the practices of speech and discourse between people. And Wittgenstein will propose the analogy of a game in order to understand how language works. So we're going to see Lyotard pulling from that today. Another critical and probably maybe the most original and important contribution for Lyotard conceptually is this discussion of the meta-narratives. in which a meta narrative is a story that legitimizes itself, which is sort of an overarching story for a culture and a society. So, for instance, just to give an example, frequently when children in the United States are raised and they're taught about the Revolutionary War, the Americans fighting against the British, the colonialists freeing themselves from oppression and so forth. And there's a sort of mythology that's been built up, which is partially true, partially not. But put it this way, the mythology of the foundation of the founding of the United States has become something of a meta narrative within American culture. It, as it were, is the story which explains why the United States and why American culture has the sorts of values it does. Um, so he actually will say that when we talk about narratives, we're talking about knowledge in modernity is accompanied by foundational narratives or self-legitimating theories that extend beyond the rules of the language game. Meta narratives are the axiomatic narratives that structure our paradigm. So your paradigm is your worldview, and we have stories which organize and help us understand what's happening and make meaning. For instance, a good example is your religious tradition. If you're a Christian, for instance, then you have a meta narrative, right, in your belief system that's organizing how you understand everything. So meta narratives are these grand narratives. I should say a meta narrative is not just an individual thing, right? So that would be maybe your personal meta narrative or something like that. But when we talk about meta narratives as such, we're talking about these narratives that blanket the society as a whole. And they're really essential for us understanding our worldview. For instance, there are different meta narratives in different cultures. Now, what is postmodernism? We're going to see the simple definition is that postmodernism is the breakdown of meta narratives. And basically, what this book called the postmodern condition is about is trying to understand that when these meta narratives break down, what happens to society, and also trying to articulate why it happens. And he's going to use a concept that's very similar to different, so I wanted to point it out to you. And it's this concept of differend. And he defines this or uses this term to refer to the idea that there's a point of conflict between language games, and it's that which cannot be represented. It's the unsayable, the event that stands beyond all representation in language. So we have a similar conceptual framework of difference located here. Now, the video series is called Understanding Existentialism, so it's probably worth mentioning, how is he an existentialist? Well, I'm going to put it this way. I think that what I want us to see is that existentialism is sort of, let's call it classic existentialism, the existentialism in Heidegger and Sartre, and so forth, provides a foundational framework that begins with existence. But I think post-structuralism and these other postmodern theories ultimately take that as their starting point. So I would sort of put it this way is I think the Lyotard's discussion of postmodernism is not per se existentialist philosophy, but I think it's consistent with existentialism. We'll notice that he really wants to focus on what happens to our existing discourse rather than trying to identify the essence of it. So I think it's all quite consistent. So just a little word about that. Okay, let's move on. Let's take a look. Let's jump into it. So, the postmodern condition, a report on knowledge. So, this was originally a report that was commissioned by the French government on the status of knowledge, and in particular, thinking about the way in which technology and as society was transforming and changing, how is that going to affect the sciences let's call it the distribution and the production of knowledge? What happens to the sciences effectively under these new conditions? And so a report was commissioned, and Lyotard wrote it. So it's a really cool thing to read. And I should mention, I'm just reading an excerpt of it. It's actually longer. Again, I'm using this anthology here, the Norton Anthology of Western Philosophy, edited by Richard Schacht, after Kant, the Interpretive Tradition. So all my page numbers follow that. But I actually have the actual book, but for whatever reason, I'm using this one today. So I encourage you to read the full text, which is a bit longer here. It really breaks this stuff down in more detail. But I think what we're going to see today is some of the essential ingredients, and you're going to see that it's quite prolific. Okay, so what's the object of the study? What's the goal? Obviously, because I just mentioned it, is to identify what the condition of knowledge is for the sciences. Now, science, first and foremost, has always been in conflict with certain narratives, right? Remember, a narrative is a story, right? With a beginning, a middle, and an end, if you will, with a conflict and resolution, etc., right? And what is science? Science refers to uh, knowledge which is not narrative based, but rather demonstrative in some sort of fashion, whether that be through experiments or it be through mathematical proofs. So science it tries to develop knowledge about what is the case, and it tends to be in conflict with narrative, because telling a story is not necessary. There is knowledge that can come out of stories, obviously, but telling a story is not demonstrative per se. It's performative. So science responds by creating really a discourse of its own legitimation, right? Instead of seeking a narrative, science legitimizes itself through its philosophy, through an evaluation and articulation of fundamental principles. Now, what is postmodernism? Well, obviously, just in terms of thinking of it in terms of history, postmodernism is the period that comes, well, after modernism. He writes, I'll use the term modern to designate any science that legitimates itself with reference to a meta discourse. So that's what modern refers to. So it refers to, again, a science which legitimates itself by reference to a meta discourse, to a philosophy of some sort, right? So the philosophy of science becomes the meta discourse, which helps to legitimate science, right? So that's kind of what's going on. And also, science is also legitimated through its own methods of demonstration. So, putting that into play, we can then ask the question again, well, what is postmodernism exactly? And he says, I'm going to define postmodern as incredulity towards meta narratives. So, what we're talking about there is postmodernism is, let's say, an allergic reaction to meta narratives, right? Postmodernism is a crisis of the meta narrative. Now, put it this way, we have narratives and then there's meta narratives, right? Uh, as it were, these principal conditions that organize, the assumptions that are curtailed. And so that means postmodernism, if it's going to be a breakdown of meta narratives, then ultimately we have a crisis of sorts from the modernist perspective. Now, there's other crises within Western philosophy, including what's called the crisis of Western metaphysics, the crisis of the university. Now we might add the crisis of democracy and so forth. So there's a lot of crises that seem to be connected. Now, each of us lives, though, at the intersection of narratives. We're going to call this the narrative function. So, as an individual, there's a whole bunch of narratives that are intersecting and are, as it were, organizing my conception of the world. But not just that, but also my place in the world for others. So we live at an intersection of narratives, right? And think about this just as a sort of example. Think about if you go to work and someone asks who you are. Well, you're brand new at a job, and they start asking you who you are and asking you why you're doing the things you do. You're going to tell a certain story about yourself, but it's probably going to be a story that's related to your career. By contrast, if you go on a date with someone romantically, and that person asks you who you are, you're going to give a narrative about your life, but it's going to be more personal. So the thing about this is that there's all these different narratives that are intersecting in our lives, and ultimately, this narrative function is what enables us to have a sense of what our lives mean to each other, but also to understand how other people fit into our lives. So there's a narrative function that's essential in human life, in human discourse. Now, put this in the context of the postmodern condition. Lyotard writes, the operative criterion of the postmodern condition is technological. It has no relevance for judging what is true or just. So, first and foremost, is we live at an intersection of narratives, but we have to recognize that in our current age, postmodernism is also a highly technological condition where we have technology also. But notice that technology doesn't determine what's true or what's just, what's wrong or what's right, what values we should hold. Technology is something we merely use to judge and determine what's true and so forth. But what we're going to see here is if you have a collapse of this meta-narrative breakdown and you have this technological formation, you're going to end up with what looks like a fragmentation of social discourse. He adds, postmodern knowledge is not simply a tool of the authorities, it refines our sensitivity to differences and reinforces our ability to tolerate incommensurable. Now, I think that's also really important because what we're going to see here is that since if we have a breakdown of meta narratives, and these narratives are not just used to control us, right, but they also allow us to recognize the differences of others and allow us to tolerate things which are different than ourselves. So it's not a surprise that the discussion of political tolerance has become such a large discussion at this point in our history. And Lyotard's going to try to relate all of this together, particularly thinking about how technology is playing this fundamental role. So let's say this: postmodernism is a condition of one meta narrative breakdown, and it also will result in what we're going to call a plurality of language games. So we're going to understand here, and we're going to talk about in a minute, the way in which language can be understood as a set of games. Because if you have a meta-narrative breakdown, what are you left with? You're left with discourse, conversations, and discussions and sciences, but these sciences become, as it were, fragmented from each other. You end up with a plurality rather than a unity. And it's number three, it has a technological orientation. So this is another important feature, and I think it's often forgotten in Lyotard's discussion here that postmodernism is a highly technological condition. So let's move now away from the introduction and let's take a look at some of the sections of his report. Beginning with number one, the field, knowledge in computerized society. So here we're looking at what is the current state of knowledge within our societies. What does the field look like, as it were? And he starts off with a hypothesis, which is, he writes, our hypothesis is that the status of knowledge is altered as societies enter what is known as the post-industrial age, and cultures enter what is known as the postmodern age. So we have a couple different things going on here that's worth mentioning. The first is there's a distinction here between society and culture. And I'm not going to go through what that might mean, but I think we want to recognize it. And he links the notion of the social or society with the notion of material post-industrialism. So I think there we can really think of the social in terms of economic and more formal systems, whereas the cultural here, and I think it's going to refer to, notice he used that term earlier, between what's true and just, right? And he says the cultural becomes postmodern. So we have post-industrialism, if we're thinking about, let's call it the material organization of society. But we have a postmodern condition when we talk about the cultural recognition of value and truth and concepts and objectivity and all the rest of it, right? And he does say that the pace of postmodern transformation will differ by country and location because of the different features. So let's be clear here that he's really referring to ideas that as the world becomes increasingly post-industrial, all these cultures are going to be heading in this direction. But on the other hand, we have to recognize that all these cultures are also very, let's call them thick and unique, meaning that the pace of this transformation will differ. And so there's not one full story. We're really looking at, let's call it the bird's eye view of this condition. He's not necessarily saying that this is going to look the same way in every case, right? Now, back to science. Science is a kind of discourse, right? So science is its own sort of discourse, just like comedy is, like if you go to a stand-up comedian, there's a sort of discourse going on. Well, science is its own kind of discourse. And every discourse takes place in language. So does science. Science has a language. And that means that the conditions of language functionally flow into the conditions of that discourse. Now, technology is becoming the means by which we're using our language with each other. So technology is transforming the conditions of language and therefore changing or altering the possibilities of discourse itself. Lyotard writes, the nature of knowledge cannot survive unchanged within this context of general transformation. It can fit into new channels and become operational only if learning is translated into quantities of information. We can predict that anything in the constituted body of knowledge that is not translatable in this way will be abandoned, and that the direction of new research will be dictated by the possibility of its eventual results being translatable into computer language. Now, that was kind of a long quote. What is he saying there? He's basically saying that if technology becomes the medium by which knowledge is flowing, let's say, then that means that things which don't fit that medium will be excluded. So we see here that technology becomes something of an exclusionary principle for knowledge. In other words, if you can't easily incorporate what is learned or known into a quantity of information that can flow into that system, then eventually we're just going to lose that kind of information altogether because we'll become increasingly more and more technological. If it doesn't fit the computer language, it can't fit our language, ironically. So this is, and here's a sort of analogy: is think about there's different sorts of pipes, right? And you can only put something in a pipe if it can fit in that pipe. And put it this way, there might be some forms of knowledge that don't fit in the pipes of our technology. And so we have technology becomes an exclusionary principle. At least that's one effect of it. Now, this means that knowledge no longer becomes an end into itself or an end in itself. He writes, knowledge in the form of an informational commodity indispensable to productive power is already and will continue to be, and, and maybe perhaps the major stake in the worldwide competition for power. It's conceivable that nation states will one day fight for control of information, just as they've battled in the past for control over territory. Now, this is pretty remarkable because Lyotard died in '98, so the internet had been invented and these technologies were coming online. But today, we now see that this is not just a hypothesis, this is in fact a description for what's happening, right? Nation states are now fighting for control of information. It maybe not in the same way they're battling for control of our territory, but this is certainly right on, I think. And this means that, and notice there, because knowledge is now funneling into the technology, knowledge becomes something that's to be used. And of course, we've always taken knowledge and used it, but notice this is very different for instance, when Aristotle says, all men by nature desire to know. In other words, knowledge is the end that we seek itself. But that meta narrative is gone. And that means that what is known is therefore funneled technologically to fuel language games, but there's no meta narrative to kind of organize it. So knowledge becomes merely a means. It becomes a tool, if you will. And the result of this, partially socially, is that the nation state as a political body becomes destabilized. He writes, already in the last few decades, economic powers have reached the point of imperiling the stability of the state through new forms of circulation of capital that go by the generic name of multinational corporations. So we can see here is that as this post-industrial situation is taking place, we're now seeing other agents beyond the nation state accumulating power and resources through the accumulation of knowledge. So this means that the sort of liberal ideal of a democracy where we vote for our politicians and we participate in the system, that whole idea loses less and less purchase in terms of how things are actually done. And of course, today, I think many voters recognize this, although they may lack, let's say, Lyotard's theoretical framework to make sense of it. Now, he even gives a timely thought experiment, which I thought was crazy when I was rereading this. It's funny, when I first read this essay, actually in the 90s, after it was published, in English, that is, I remember reading these things and thinking, oh, it seems very, all hypothetical. Now it seems almost like untimely. He writes this, he gives a little thought experiment. He says, the question threatens to become even more thorny with the development of computer technology and telematics. Suppose, for example, that a firm such as IBM is authorized to occupy a belt in the Earth's orbital field and launch communication satellites or satellites housing data banks. Who will have access to them? Who will determine which channels of data are forbidden? The state, or will the state simply be one user among many? By the way, there's a couple spelling errors in there. It's funny, I always reread it when I miss them, so I apologize. But I think what he's saying here, he says, for instance, maybe someday there'll be a corporation that owns satellites around the Earth. Who controls all of those? Notice that this has already happened. SpaceX here has already begun, they've already created and they're continuing to build out a huge satellite network. And just in the war in Ukraine currently, the Ukrainian government is relying upon SpaceX's satellites. And Elon Musk famously has, or had challenged the use of his satellites for the war. Now, the question is, who controls them? Well, it looks like SpaceX controls them. So this is a sort of thought experiment that he gives, which seems very sci-fi, and it ultimately ended up happening. So again, I think that he's quite prolific. He writes, In this light, the new technologies can only increase the urgency of such a re-examination, since they make the information used in decision making even more mobile and subject to piracy. So we sort of get here what the field looks like. The field looks like something that's destabilizing with different centers of power, and these old social organizations are threatened, and this could be very bad potentially, right? So moving to the question of legitimation, right? Because remember, without a grand narrative, then how are things legitimated? Or by what reference to a grand narrative are things legitimated in the postmodern condition? He writes, the scenario of the computerization of the most highly developed societies allows us to spotlight certain aspects of the transformation of knowledge. Now, first off, one, knowledge is cumulative. I think it always has been, but knowledge is getting bigger and bigger. It's accumulating. Because notice knowledge is also understood as a quantity rather than a quality of things. So as a quanta, if you will, it can be accumulated and amassed. Number two, scientific knowledge, though, doesn't actually refer to the totality of knowledge. There are more things, other forms of knowledge out there besides just the totality of scientific knowledge. So other forms of knowledge we can refer to as being narrative forms of knowledge, the stories we tell of each other. For instance, you can even think of the kind of knowledge that you gain by reading Shakespeare's Hamlet, right? That's a different type of knowledge. You know something afterwards. Now, it's not scientific knowledge, but it's humanistic knowledge, and it's knowledge about the human condition per se. So there's other forms of knowledge, right? Beyond that. So you have to recognize there's a multiplicity or a plurality of knowledge. Now, what is legitimation? Legitimation is the process by which a legislature or some body is authorized to promulgate such a law as a norm. So, legitimation is where a discourse is made legitimate because it conforms to a law that's given, or a norm, or a value, let's say. Now, he says, now take the example of a scientific statement. It's subject to the rule that a statement must fulfill a given set of the conditions in order to be accepted as scientific. In other words, what legitimation is the process by which a legislature or a body that decides deals with scientific discourse and then authorizes certain conditions where we can differentiate when a statement gets included in that discourse and when it gets excluded, right? And we can think here about, we like to think that the scientist just do experiments, but to be clear, something isn't really considered known per se until it's agreed upon by the scientific community, right? You can think about, for instance, the question, is Pluto a planet, for instance? And it was on full display a couple years back when, by a show of hands and a vote, right, the planetary, I think it was the planetary, International Planetary Society, or whoever it was, by a show of hands and a vote, they voted that Pluto was not a planet. So notice there, that means that is a process of legitimation, and it is socially constructed out of the community. It's not simply a reading off of the conclusion of a report or an experiment. Knowledge is developed socially, even in science, and there's a legitimation structure to it. So that means that if we're talking about legitimation structure, there's also a power structure at play as well, right? He writes, there's a strict interlinkage between the kind of language called science and the kind called ethics and politics. So we have to be really careful here. So I think that we like to think of science as being purely objective and being, as it were, apolitical, or as it were, outside of the political sphere. And maybe, and that's sort of, I think, comes as a result of the grand narratives we have about science. But in the postmodern condition, we have to recognize that science has a strong affinity of a power structure within it because of this legitimation process or structure. So this brings us to the language games, because here we have to talk about how is the discourse actually constructed internally. And this is where he's going to rely upon the Ludwig Wittgenstein's conception of language games, which comes from his book, The Philosophical Investigations. I encourage you to take a look at my video lecture on Wittgenstein to give you a little bit more information. But what we can say here, just by way of sort of quickly summarizing Wittgenstein, is that we have to understand that language is not a totality of definitions, nor is it a logical system or a hierarchy, right? We like to think of language as like a computer program where you design the code and it all makes sense, it's all logical. That's thinking of it as in terms of a logical hierarchy. But instead, we want to think of language or as not as a totality or an accumulation of concepts and terms. Instead, we're going to conceive of language as a game that's played between players. Now, this is quite existential in the sense that this means instead of trying to understand what language is theoretically and then think about how it gets applied within an actual context, we're reversing the scenario. We would begin with the actual context and then understand how that context filters into the conceptual and the theoretical. So it's existential in the sense that we begin with the existence of language and then move to its essence. So notice, go back to Sartre's original definition of existentialism, and you can see here that I think contemporary postmodern philosophy is fundamentally existentialist in its orientation. Now, language gets conceived as a game, and it's rooted in linguistic practices, right? The things we do with each other. There's no philosophical essence, right? There's no absolute Platonic ideal for each or definitions for all of our concepts. Instead, language has to be understood as moves that are made according to rules within a language game. Let me give you an example. This is my own example, not Lyotard's. But for instance, think of the word soul, right? Normally, so let's imagine, for instance, you go to a funeral and you hear a priest or a minister of some sort say, "This person, God, please take this person's soul," right? Please, bless this person's soul. Well, in that context, there's certain rules under which the word soul is to be understood, but it's given. Those rules are given by its contextual clues and the practices in which is taking place. In that context, when someone says soul, the priest, then what that seems to mean is it seems to refer to the ghost inside of a person, the thing that lives on, right? A metaphysical concept. Now, let me change the full scenario. Let's imagine, for instance, you go to a jazz club at night. You hear this amazing jazz musician, and the person you're with turns to you and says, "Wow, that musician has soul," right? Notice that there's a different context, same word, but that word has a different meaning because of that context. There's different rules in that, right? What that means is when someone says that the musician has soul, they're referring to the idea that there's an emotional passion going on or something like this, right? That's what they're referring to. Like, you could break the language again. Imagine, for instance, if you tried to respond to that person in the way you would as if you were a funeral, right? So they say, "Man, that musician has a lot of soul," and your response is, "Do you think that soul will go to heaven?" Right, or something like that. They would look at you very weird because you're violating the rules of that language game. But that language game is given by the practice in which it's existing. So there's no essence per se to the concept of soul. Instead, it's rooted in these language games. And there's similarities between these language games. Wittgenstein calls these family resemblances. Now, Lyotard wants to use this concept of language games to basically understand what happens when the grand narratives break down. He writes, Wittgenstein, taking up the study of language again from scratch, focuses his attention on the effects of different modes of discourse. He calls the various types of utterances he identifies along the way language games. What he means by this term is that each of the various categories of utterance can be defined in terms of the rules specifying their properties and uses. So, that brings us to number 4, the nature of the social bond, the modern alternative. And what Lyotard wants to do in this section is sort of say, okay, what is the modern view of how our societies are stitched together? And he's going to say there's really just two main models. One is what he calls thinking of society as a functional whole, a unity. And the second is thinking of society as divided, thinking of it as a duality. So, really, one way of looking at society is to think about the way in which all of it's organized and related together as if it was one full thing. And the other way is to say, well, it's divided into some sort of fundamental tension. You can think about Hegel here or Marx. And he gives the example of Talcott Parson, a sociologist who views society as a functional whole, right? He writes, in Parsons' work, the principle behind the system is still, if I may say so, optimistic. It corresponds to the stabilization of the growth, economies, and societies of abundance under the aegis of a modern welfare state. The true goal of the system, the reason it programs itself like a computer, is the optimization of the global relationship between input and output. In other words, performativity. So think about it this way. Here's an example. You can understand society as a functional whole, particularly when you look at it economically. And think about the way in which if you listen to the news and they're talking about the economy and the relationship of inflation or whatever the case might be around the world, we're thinking of one system that we're trying to um, optimize in terms of its performance. So this is the functional whole way. The other way is this duality, and he gives the example of Marxism. And Marxism effectively recognizes that society is in tension with a class structure. So this is the duality model, let's call it. He writes, traditional theory has always been in danger of being incorporated into the programming of the social whole as a simple tool for the optimization of this performance. Critical theory, which by the way refers to a let's call it a school of later Marxist, critical theory based on the principle of dualism and wary of the synthesis and reconciliation, should be in a position to avoid this feat. What guides Marxism then is a different model of society and a different conception of the function of knowledge that can be produced by the society and acquired from it. So that means that, but what we'll see here is that both models understand society as something that gets programmed, but under different principles, right? He writes, everywhere the critique of political economy and its correlate, the critique of alienated society, are used in one way or another as aids in programming society. So when we look at the balance sheet, that's his words, of these two different models, we see they're kind of doing the same thing. Now, what happens to the social bond in the postmodern from the postmodern perspective? Here, first off, we have to recognize the role of technology. So technology becomes the medium by which one accesses information. And so that means that we talked about that as a sort of exclusionary principle. He writes, suffice it to say that functions of regulation and therefore of reproduction are being and will be further withdrawn from administrators and entrusted to machines. Increasingly, the central question is becoming who will have access to the information. These machines must have in storage to guarantee that the right decisions are made. So you can see here, one of the things that's taking place in the postmodern condition is that we're slowly giving over information to these machines that's entrusted to the machines in one way or another. And so you have a question of access. Who actually has access to that information? And you can see here, access is largely dictated by economic conditions, right? The other thing is, with technology, we have new actors potentially. We talked about how multi corporations, and SpaceX, for instance, are providing are new actors in terms of the access of information. Lyotard writes, what is new in all of this is that the old poles of attraction by nation states, parties, professions, institutions, historical traditions are losing their attraction. And it doesn't look as though they will be replaced, and at least not on the former scale. So, what we see here is you have a breakdown of narratives, and you have a new change in technology, which is regulating the flow of information, and which means that you have what was before it no longer is, right? And this is where we have to now really bring into the equation what we might call the breakdown of these grand narratives. What happens? Well, number one, social relationships are reduced to gameplay. Remember, we have the discourse, the mode of discourse becomes merely a language game, right? And there's no grand narrative to authorize or legitimate it any longer. So that means that the only legitimation that the games have comes in the moves and the play of the players. He writes, one's mobility in relation to these language game effects is tolerable, at least within certain limits. It's even solicited by regulatory mechanisms, in particular by the self, adjustments the system undertakes in order to improve its performance. So notice here is that we have a situation where technology works through an optimization and principle of efficiency, and we have gameplay now, which the legitimation is just given in the practice. And so what you have is that the moves themselves become essential. So the novelty, he writes, of the unexpected moves becomes a characteristic feature. Now, to be clear, Lyotard says, I'm not saying that all social relationships will become a sort of postmodern gameplay, but he thinks that most of them will socially. So to be clear here, remember, we're talking about this condition changing at different speeds in different societies, and we're not also saying that it's absolute in every case. but by large measure, social relationships will become gameplay. Notice, for instance, if you watch cable news in the United States or even in Britain or even in France, what you'll see is that increasingly uh, debates in the political sphere look like gameplay. It looks like there has to be a winner and a loser, and people are using their language politically in order to win another player. Instead of win over another player, they're trying to win against another player. So what's happening is social relationships will increasingly become antagonistic with each other, increasing conflict. Now, so what are some of the problems? And I mentioned just now the agonistic, he used the term agonistic, but antagonistic aspects of society. Now, one thing we can mention is that if you have a breakdown of the grand narratives, that means that people's understanding is dependent upon their local gameplay, with whatever language game they're playing. And that means that the messages will mean different things to different people. So you have something of what I might call a translation problem. It becomes increasingly difficult to translate what one means to another group because they're playing a different language game and there's no grand narrative that you can reference in order to it. Now, to be clear, you may not have, there's no grand narrative, but they may have different grand narratives, as it were. And therefore, it becomes increasingly difficult to actually communicate, right? Messages have quite different forms and effects depending on whether they are, for example, denotative, prescriptive, evaluated as performative, or etc. And here we can even ask, if we're thinking about technology, is a machine's programming for efficiency good in all cases? Here's a simple example. Twitter only allows a short post. I forgot what the character limit is on Twitter, right? But they're very short. Notice that's a type of efficiency. It forces the individual who's tweeting to crystallize their thoughts in the smallest amount of space possible. That means that people are optimizing their own language to the machine for efficiency when you're using Twitter. Now, is efficiency good in all cases? Can everything important be said that's efficient, or is everything efficient always good? And you can see here, I think probably not, right? So we're losing something as this happens. And there's also means that society becomes increasingly conflicted, where individuals or small groups become like atoms that are in tension with each other. Lyotard writes, the atoms are placed at the crossroads of pragmatic relationships, but they're also displaced by the messages that traverse them in perpetual motion. Each language partner, when I move pertaining to him is made, undergoes a displacement, an alteration of some kind, that not only affects him in his capacity as addressee and referent, but also as a sender. The moves necessary provoke counter moves, and everyone knows that a move that's merely reactional is not a good move. So there's a little bit of an error there. My apologies. But so you can see what happens to these language games, right? It becomes counter moves, people are reactionary. He's essentially describing the social conditions which undergird the problem of what we might call internet trolls, right? And it has to do with the atomization of the social bond. So the social bond is basically breaking up. He writes, this atomization of the social into flexible networks of language games may seem far removed from the modern reality, which is depicted, on the contrary, as afflicted with bureaucratic paralysis. But notice here, I think this quote's too old, because I think today we all recognize that this is what's happening. So when he first wrote this, right, remember he's writing for the French government, and people, when they're always complaining about the government, are thinking about the bureaucracy of the government and the total control of the government. But notice that he's saying that what's going to happen is that the social bond of society will fragment and change. And that seems really different from the way it was. Today, I think it sounds very, very prolific. It's because we're talking about a movement from, if you will, from social bond to social networks. So what does that mean? It means the discourse gets transformed. Now, and there's two different ways. Discourse is transformed as individuals, and it's also transformed institutionally. Now, he writes, in the ordinary use of discourse, for example, in a discussion between two friends, the interlocutors, the two people having the conversation, will use any available ammunition. They'll change games from one utterance to the next, questions, requests, assertions that are launched pell-mell into battle. The war is now with rules, is not with rule. The war is with rules, but the rules allow and encourage the greatest possible flexibility of utterance. So you end up with a case where people are constantly trying to debate rather than discuss, let's say. And then from an institutional perspective, an institution differs from a conversation in that it always requires supplementary constraints for statements to be declared admissible within its bounds, right? So the constraints function to filter discursive potential, interrupted possible connections in these communication networks. There are things that should not be said. There are also privileged. They also privilege certain kinds of statements. Sometimes only one, which is predominant, which who is predominantly characterized the discourse of the particular institution. There are things that should be said, and there are ways of saying them. So institutionally, what happens is the institutions function as conditions for helping to legitimize what is sayable and what's not sayable. So we see sort of kind of two different transformative effects taking place in discourse. And there's probably a lot more we could be said there, but we're going to stop there because this at least gives us a sense of what the postmodern condition is. And it's interesting when I first, like I was mentioning earlier, when I first read this years ago, I thought, wow, this is very interesting, but it's so postmodern and it's so theoretical. Now I'm reading it more as a history. And so I think that Lyotard's evaluation of the condition, particularly as it relates to technology and the breakup of grand narratives, is quite instructive. And we couldn't have that discursive analysis if we didn't have, as it were, the existential assumption that we have to begin by looking at existence and recognizing how that informs essence. So this is Understanding Existentialism. Thank you guys for watching The Postmodern Condition and our essay on, or our discussion of Jean-Franck Lyotard's philosophy.